In this 1904 portrait of a smiling bride, her necklace tells a dark story. Dr. Michael Thompson had spent 15 years as a curator at the Charleston Heritage Museum, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover on that humid September morning in 2019. The museum had recently acquired a collection of early 20th century photographs from an estate sale, and Michael's task was to catalog and digitize them for the archives. Most were unremarkable: stiff family portraits, faded landscapes, children posed awkwardly in their Sunday best. Then he opened a leather portfolio marked simply Wedding 1904. The photograph inside took his breath away. A young African-American woman stood in a modest parlor, wearing a white cotton dress with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. But it was her expression that struck him first. Unlike the solemn faces typical of that era's photography, she was smiling. A genuine, radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire frame. Her hands were clasped at her waist, and around her neck hung what appeared to be a simple metallic necklace. Michael carefully placed the photograph on the light table and examined it more closely. Something about the image nagged at him, though he couldn't quite articulate what. The composition was beautiful, the preservation remarkable for a photograph over a century old. Outside, the Charleston humidity pressed against the museum's windows, blurring the historic district beyond into a watercolor of antebellum architecture and live oak trees. Inside, the air conditioning hummed quietly, preserving countless artifacts from the ravages of time and climate. He made a note to have the photograph scanned at high resolution. This one deserved special attention. The portfolio contained several other images, but none captivated him like this one. There was something in the woman's posture, the way she stood with such dignity and confidence despite the modest surroundings. The parlor behind her was simple: wooden floors, plain walls, a single chair visible in the corner. But she wore her wedding dress with the bearing of royalty. As he set the photograph aside, his fingers lingered on the edge of the frame. There was a story here. He could feel it in his bones. The woman's smile held secrets that a century hadn't erased, and that necklace, barely visible in the aged photograph, seemed to catch the light in an unusual way. The metal looked dark against her skin, substantial yet somehow delicate. Michael didn't know it yet, but he had just found something that would change everything he thought he knew about resilience, memory, and the weight of history carried forward through generations. 3 weeks later, Michael sat in the museum's digital laboratory, waiting as the high-resolution scanner processed the 1904 wedding photograph. The machine hummed softly in the small room, and bright light swept across the delicate image, capturing every fiber of paper, every grain of silver halide that had preserved this moment for over a century. The technician had promised him the highest resolution the equipment could manage, 6400 dpi, enough to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. When the file finally appeared on his computer screen, Michael leaned forward, his coffee growing cold beside him, forgotten. He started with the woman's face, marveling at how clearly her features came through in the enhanced image. Her eyes held a complexity of emotions: joy, certainly, but something deeper too. Pride, perhaps. Determination. A quiet strength that transcended the limitations of the photographic medium. He could see the texture of her skin, a small beauty mark near her left ear, the careful way her hair had been styled and pinned. He moved slowly across the image, examining the details of her dress, the intricate lacework that someone had carefully stitched, the small buttons running down the back, visible where she had turned slightly. The worn floorboards beneath her feet spoke of a modest home, well-maintained but weathered by time and use. Then he reached the necklace, and everything changed. Michael's hand froze on the mouse. He zoomed in further, and his breath caught in his throat. What he had assumed was a decorative chain was something else entirely. The metal wasn't uniform or smooth. It bore distinct hammer marks, irregular links that had been painstakingly shaped by hand, not cast in a factory mold. The links varied slightly in size, suggesting individual forging rather than mass production. But it was the wear patterns that made his heart pound against his ribs. Deep grooves circled certain links, the kind of abrasion that came from constant friction against skin over months or years. The metal was darkest in these worn areas, polished smooth by endless movement. And there, barely visible even in the enhanced high-resolution image, were what looked like file marks where something substantial had been removed, perhaps heavier restraining elements or a lock mechanism. "That's not jewelry," Michael whispered to the empty room, his voice sounding strange in the silence. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Michael spent the next morning in the museum's climate-controlled archives, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the musty smell of old paper that no amount of preservation technology could completely eliminate. The photograph had come from the estate of Eleanor Price, a Charleston resident who had died at 97 with no living relatives. Her belongings had been liquidated at auction, and the museum had purchased a collection of family documents and photographs that the auction house had deemed of historical interest. Now Michael needed to find out who the woman in the wedding portrait was, and what her connection to Eleanor might be. He carefully sifted through letters, deeds and certificates, creating a timeline of the Price family history on his laptop. Eleanor had been born in 1922, which meant the bride in the photograph couldn't have been her mother. The dates didn't align. Perhaps a grandmother or great-aunt. The documents were frustratingly incomplete, with gaps in the genealogical record that were common for African-American families from that era. Birth certificates were scarce, and many records had been lost or never properly kept in the first place. Then at the bottom of the third box, Michael found a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. Inside, written in careful, elegant script, were the words, "Family History, recorded by Eleanor Price, 1985. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The first entry read, "My great-grandmother Rose was married on June 14, 1904, in Charleston. She wore the necklace, as was tradition. This is her story, passed down so we never forget." Michael's pulse quickened. Rose. He finally had a name. He read further, his eyes scanning the pages hungrily. Eleanor had documented family stories told to her by her grandmother, Rose's daughter. The journal spoke of slavery, of emancipation, of survival and transformation. And it mentioned the necklace repeatedly, always with reverence, always with weight. The necklace was made from Grandmother Ruth's chains, one passage read. After freedom came, she had them changed, made into something we could choose to wear. Michael sat back in his chair, the full implication washing over him like a wave. The necklace wasn't just jewelry, it was a shackle transformed. A deliberate act of reclamation, turning an instrument of bondage into a symbol of endurance and choice. The journal revealed Ruth's story in fragments, pieces of oral history that Eleanor had carefully transcribed decades after the events occurred. Ruth had been born into slavery in 1838 on a rice plantation 30 miles north of Charleston. Michael cross-referenced the details with plantation records held in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, and after 2 days of searching, he found her, listed simply as Ruth, house servant, in the 1860 census of enslaved people. No last name, no age given beyond adult female, just a line item in someone else's ledger. According to Eleanor's journal, Ruth had been punished repeatedly for teaching other enslaved children to read, a crime under South Carolina law. Each time she was caught, the punishment grew more severe. The final time, in 1863, the overseer had ordered an iron collar forged for her, a punishment collar meant to humiliate and restrict. The collar was heavy with a chain that hung down her chest, marking her as disobedient, making her an example to others who might defy the rules that kept them in bondage. Ruth wore that collar for 2 years, through 1863 and 1864, even as the Civil War raged and rumors of emancipation began to spread through the slave quarters in whispers and coded songs. Eleanor's journal noted that Ruth's daughter, Rose's mother, remembered her own mother's neck bearing permanent scars, indentations in the skin where the metal had pressed day after day, month after month. The weight of it had caused chronic pain, made sleeping difficult, marked her physically and psychologically. When Union troops arrived in Charleston in February 1865, Ruth was among the first to be freed. According to family legend, the moment the soldiers cut the lock on her collar, she didn't throw it away. Instead, she gathered the pieces carefully, wrapped them in cloth, and kept them hidden under the floorboards of the small cabin she shared with her daughters. For years, those pieces remained there, a reminder of what had been endured and what had been survived. Michael stared at the journal entry, imagining Ruth's hands wrapping those chains in fabric, choosing to keep the evidence of her suffering rather than destroying it. It was an act of profound courage, to hold on to pain, not to wallow in it, but to remember, to testify, to transform it into something with meaning and purpose for the generations that would follow. In 1902, according to Eleanor's meticulous journal, Ruth made a decision that would echo through generations. She was 64 years old, her body worn by decades of hard labor and the lingering effects of those years in the punishment collar. Her granddaughter Rose, then 18, was engaged to be married to a young carpenter named James, who had recently moved to Charleston from Columbia. Ruth wanted to give Rose something meaningful for her wedding, something that connected her to her heritage and reminded her of the strength that ran through their family's veins. Ruth took the pieces of the iron collar from their hiding place and brought them to a blacksmith named Samuel, a formerly enslaved man who had learned his trade during bondage and now ran a small forge on the edge of Charleston's freedmen's community. Michael found Samuel's business listed in the 1902 Charleston City Directory and a record of his death in 1910, but little else about his life. According to the journal, Ruth told Samuel exactly what she wanted. Transform the shackle into something beautiful, but keep enough of the original form that its history would never be forgotten. Samuel worked for weeks on the project. He heated the iron until it glowed red in his forge, then carefully hammered out the heaviest, most brutal sections, the parts that had been designed specifically to cause pain and mark Ruth as property. He kept the links that had encircled her neck, the ones that bore the wear patterns of her skin, the grooves that testified to her endurance. These he cleaned and smoothed, removing rust and rough edges, but preserving the essential character of the forged iron and the marks that time and suffering had left upon it. Then Samuel added his own artistry. He forged a delicate clasp, something that could be opened and closed with ease, a choice, not a compulsion. He polished certain sections of the metal until they caught the light, creating contrast with the darker, worn areas. The result was extraordinary, a necklace that looked like jewelry at first glance, but on closer inspection revealed its true origins. It was heavy enough to feel substantial against the skin, to remind the wearer of its history, but light enough to be worn comfortably, to be chosen freely. When Ruth saw the finished piece, Eleanor wrote, she wept. Not from sorrow, but from a complex mixture of emotions that transcended simple categories. Grief for what had been lost, pride in what had been survived, hope for what her granddaughter's generation might build in freedom. June 14th, 1904, dawned clear and warm over Charleston. Rose woke before sunrise in the small house she shared with her mother and grandmother, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Today she would marry James, and tonight she would move into the modest home he had built with his own hands on the northern edge of the city. But first, there was the tradition Ruth had created, a tradition that would be passed down through generations yet unborn. Ruth came to Rose's room carrying a wooden box. Inside, wrapped in white linen, lay the transformed necklace. This was made from the chains I wore, Ruth told her granddaughter, her voice steady despite the weight of memory. I wore it in bondage without choice. Today, you will wear it in freedom because you choose to. You will wear it to remember where we came from, what we survived, and to carry that strength forward into your new life. Rose lifted the necklace from its wrapping, feeling its substantial weight in her hands. The iron was cool against her palms, the links clinking softly together with a sound that was both musical and sobering. She could see the hammer marks Samuel had left visible, the wear patterns from her grandmother's skin, the careful craftsmanship that had transformed suffering into something that could be honored and remembered. Her mother fastened the clasp at the back of Rose's neck, and Rose felt the weight settle against her collarbone. Not oppressive, but present, grounding her in a history that was both painful and precious. The photographer arrived mid-morning, a white man named Harold who operated a studio downtown and did occasional work in the freedmen's community. He set up his camera in the front parlor, arranging Rose near the window where natural light would illuminate her face. Harold worked with professional efficiency, occasionally suggesting small adjustments to Rose's posture or the angle of her head. When he was satisfied with the composition, he ducked under the black cloth behind his camera. Hold very still, he instructed. And if you can manage it, a pleasant expression would be nice. But Rose didn't offer a polite, restrained smile typical of portrait photography. Instead, she smiled broadly, genuinely, radiantly, a smile that contained multitudes. Joy for her wedding day, pride in her heritage, defiance against anyone who might think her people broken by their history. The shutter clicked, capturing that smile, that necklace, that moment for posterity. Michael's investigation took him deeper into Charleston's African-American community history. Using Eleanor's journal as a guide, he began searching for descendants of Rose and James, hoping to find someone who might know what had happened to the necklace after Rose's wedding day. The trail was complicated. Families had moved, names had changed through marriage, and records for black families in the early 20th century were often incomplete or poorly preserved in official archives. He started with church records. Eleanor's journal mentioned that Rose and James had been married at Mother Emanuel AME Church, the same historic church that would become nationally known over a century later following a tragic shooting in 2015. Michael visited the church's archives, where a patient archivist helped him search through baptism records, marriage certificates, and membership rolls. There he found Rose and James's names and began to trace their family forward through time. Rose and James had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The eldest daughter, Mary, was born in 1905, exactly 9 months and 2 weeks after the wedding. Michael found Mary's wedding announcement in the Charleston Chronicle, a black-owned newspaper from 1927. The announcement was brief, but it mentioned that the bride wore a treasured family heirloom passed down from her grandmother. Michael's heart raced. The necklace had been worn again. He tracked Mary's daughter Ruth, named after her great-grandmother, who had married in 1952. Through census records and city directories, Michael pieced together Ruth's life. She had worked as a teacher, raised 2 daughters, and lived in Charleston until her death in 1988. Her obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her mother Mary and survived by her daughters, Angela and Patricia. Michael now had contemporary names, people who might still be living in Charleston or nearby. A search of online phone directories yielded nothing for Angela, but he found a Patricia Johnson living in Mount Pleasant, just across the Cooper River from Charleston. Michael's hands shook slightly as he dialed the number. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious and slightly suspicious. Hello. Hello. My name is Dr. Michael Thompson. I'm a curator at the Charleston Heritage Museum, and I'm trying to locate descendants of a woman named Rose who was married in 1904. Would you happen to be related to that family line? There was a long pause. Then quietly, Rose was my great-great-grandmother. Why are you asking? 3 days later, Michael sat in Patricia Johnson's living room in Mount Pleasant, surrounded by family photographs and the aroma of fresh coffee. Patricia, a retired nurse in her early 60s, had agreed to meet with him after he explained about the photograph and his research. On the coffee table between them lay several albums she had brought out from a closet, their pages filled with images spanning generations. My grandmother Ruth told me about the necklace when I was 12, Patricia said, carefully turning pages in one of the albums. She showed me her wedding pictures, 1952, right after she finished teacher's college. There she is, wearing the same necklace Rose wore. She pointed to a photograph where a young woman in a modest white dress stood beside a man in a dark suit, and around her neck was the unmistakable iron necklace, its distinctive links visible even in the black and white image. Patricia explained that the tradition had continued through 4 generations. Rose wore it in 1904. Her daughter Mary wore it in 1927. Mary's daughter Ruth wore it in 1952. And Patricia's mother, Angela, wore it in 1976 when she married Patricia's father in a small ceremony at Mother Emanuel. Mama always said it was the most important thing she owned. Patricia remembered, her voice thick with emotion. More important than her wedding ring, more important than any inheritance. It was our history made physical. Michael leaned forward. Patricia, do you know where the necklace is now? This was the question that had driven him to find her, the missing piece of the puzzle. Patricia's expression shifted, a mixture of pride and melancholy crossing her features. She stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound box that looked similar to the one Ruth had used to present the necklace to Rose nearly a century earlier. My mother wore it in 1976, and she planned to pass it to me when I got married in 1985, Patricia said, sitting back down with the box in her lap. But by then, I had learned more about our family history, about what that necklace represented. I thought about Ruth, my great-great-great-grandmother, wearing chains for 2 years. I thought about how she kept them, transformed them, made them into something we could choose to wear. She paused, her fingers tracing the box's edge, and I realized that her story, our story, needed to be shared beyond our family. Keeping it private felt like letting her suffering remain invisible. Patricia opened the leather box, and there, nestled in white silk, lay the necklace. Michael's breath caught as he saw it in person for the first time, the iron links dark and substantial, the wear patterns visible even after more than a century, the delicate clasp that transformed it from restraint to choice. Patricia lifted it gently, the links clinking softly together, and held it up to the light streaming through her window. In 1960, my mother and grandmother made a decision together, Patricia continued, her eyes fixed on the necklace. The civil rights movement was growing stronger, and they felt that Ruth's story, all of our ancestors' stories, needed to be preserved not just in family memory, but in public memory. They wanted people to understand not just the brutality of slavery, but also the resilience, the creativity, the absolute refusal to let that brutality define us completely. She explained that Angela and Ruth had approached the Charleston Heritage Museum with an offer. They would donate the necklace along with the wedding photographs from all 4 generations, Eleanor's journal, and detailed documentation of the family history. In exchange, the museum would commit to displaying the necklace and telling Ruth's story as part of their permanent exhibition on Charleston's African American history. The museum had agreed, and in a small ceremony in December 1960, Angela had worn the necklace one final time before placing it in the museum's care. But then something happened, Patricia said, her expression darkening. The museum's director at the time, this was before integration, before the Civil Rights Act, he accepted the donation but never put it on display. He filed it away in storage with a vague note about folk artifacts and no mention of the collar, the transformation, or Ruth's story. My grandmother was furious, but there was little she could do. The legal donation had been completed, and in 1960, a black woman didn't have much recourse against a white-run institution. Michael felt a wave of shame wash over him, even though he hadn't been born when this happened. Patricia, I had no idea. This never should have... She raised her hand, stopping him gently. I know you weren't responsible, but now you understand why this matters so much. For 60 years, Ruth's necklace has been hidden in your museum's storage, her story untold, her transformation from enslaved to free woman reduced to an inventory number in a database. 6 months later, on a warm June morning in 2020, almost exactly 116 years after Rose's wedding, the Charleston Heritage Museum unveiled a new permanent exhibition titled Chains Transformed Stories of Resilience and Reclamation. At the center of the exhibition, lit carefully to highlight every detail, hung Ruth's necklace in a custom-designed display case. Beside it were the 4 wedding photographs, Rose in 1904, Mary in 1927, Ruth in 1952, and Angela in 1976, showing each woman wearing the same necklace, their smiles echoing across generations. Michael had spent months working with Patricia, local historians, and community leaders to ensure the exhibition told Ruth's story with the dignity and complexity it deserved. The display included excerpts from Eleanor's journal, historical context about punishment collars and slavery in South Carolina, information about Samuel the blacksmith who had transformed the shackle, and a video installation where Patricia and other descendants shared family memories and reflected on what the necklace meant to them. The opening ceremony drew over 300 people. Patricia stood near the display, surrounded by family members, cousins she had reconnected with during the research process, young people who were learning their family history for the first time, elders who remembered hearing stories about Ruth from their grandparents. When Michael invited her to speak, Patricia approached the podium with the same dignity her ancestor Rose had shown in that 1904 photograph. "My great-great-great-grandmother Ruth wore chains that were meant to break her spirit," Patricia said, her voice steady and clear. "Instead, she took those chains and made them into something her descendants could choose to wear, not as a burden, but as a testament. She transformed suffering into strength, bondage into legacy. This necklace reminds us that we are not defined by what was done to us, but by how we respond, how we survive, how we transform pain into purpose." As the ceremony concluded and visitors began to move through the exhibition, Michael stood back and watched an elderly woman lean close to the display case, studying Rose's photograph. She pointed to the necklace and whispered something to the young girl beside her, perhaps her granddaughter. The girl leaned in, her eyes widening as she noticed the hammer marks, the wear patterns, the weight of history made visible. In that moment, Michael understood the true power of what he had helped bring to light. Ruth's story was no longer hidden in storage, reduced to an inventory number. It was alive again, speaking across centuries, reminding everyone who encountered it that resilience can transform even the heaviest chains into something chosen, something meaningful, something that connects past to present and ensures that suffering is never forgotten, but also never the final word.